According to legend, he was Britain's greatest king.
The name of King Arthur resonates very deeply with the British.
King Arthur led his Knights of the Round Table from Camelot, a vast, spectacular castle built on a hill. But was the legend of Camelot based on reality, or simply a myth?
It's a very fuzzy and vague place. It's glorious and it's glamorous.
If King Arthur really did exist, then the remains of his castle Camelot should lie buried somewhere in Britain. But where? In the 1960s, a team of archaeologists used the latest technology to try to prove the legend was real. They were led by Leslie Alcock, a brilliant, energetic showman who brought modern archaeology into the mainstream.
And in 1966,
Leslie Alcock was one of the rock and roll archaeologists of his day.
Alcock identified a hill in Somerset, close to Glastonbury, as the most likely location for Camelot. But could he really prove it was the site of King Arthur's castle? If he succeeded, it would be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The man who would lay claim to Camelot was born in Manchester in 1925. As a boy, Leslie Alcock was a brilliant student, determined to better himself both mentally and physically.
Dad seems to have been full of energy and drive. I found in his cycling diaries that he used to cycle 30 miles a day before going to school in the mornings. And you see that intellectually as well.
He won a scholarship to Manchester Grammar and then another to Brasenose College, Oxford. But his education was interrupted. During the Second World War, Alcock was posted to India, where he joined the 7th Gurkha Rifles. He became fascinated by the subcontinent's history and archaeology. He learnt that the past isn't just what people write in textbooks, but often something tangible, hidden in the ground. In India, he would eventually go on to work for one of Britain's most flamboyant archaeologists, Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
The story I'm telling you is not fantasy.
Wheeler's role was quite crucial in a way. One of the newspaper reporters said if he hadn't turned into a great archaeologist, he'd have been a matinee idol.
Moreover, we can relate this evidence.
He was an amazingly charismatic character.
Which, it is agreed...
It's towards the end of his active life, but nonetheless, boy, could he still carry it on. And, I mean, terrible old goat still.
Dad was invited by Sir Mortimer Wheeler to work at Mohenjo-Daro, this incredibly important dig into the centre of the Indus civilization. And I think he was taken on for a lot for his language skills, for his ability to get on with the locals, as much for his archaeological skills.
In 1946, Alcock returned to a very different Britain to the one he had left. Post-war, with its empire crumbling, the country was shattered, hungry, and in need of a lift. A country desperate for new heroes. In the early 1950s, morale was boosted by the British expedition's conquest of Everest. And Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. Reminders that Britain could still be great.
He'd obviously used up his last ounce of energy, but what an achievement for Bannister and Britain.
But there was one hero from the past people turned to more than any other.
The modern growth of Arthur is something that happened after the Second World War, when people were thinking more about national roots, how they came to be so and so forth.
There was a resurgence of interest in the Arthurian legends, I think primarily because King Arthur was seen as a figure who'd united his country in order to fight off Germanic invaders.
King Arthur was known as the once and future king. Legend said he would rise again and restore Britain to greatness.
Part of the story is that Arthur is not really dead. He's in the Isle of Avalon, or he's in a cave of sleep or somewhere. And the idea grew up that somehow or other Arthur would return and there would be a new golden age in Britain.
Such was the fascination with King Arthur. Post-war historians and archaeologists wanted to prove the legend was based on facts, not just myth, and that Britain's very identity was forged under the blade of the mighty king. King Arthur was supposed to have ruled in the Dark Ages, around 500 AD. He was said to have been born on the Cornish Isle of Tintagel, under the watchful eye of the wizard Merlin. The story goes that Arthur became the true king of the Britons, as only he could draw the sword Excalibur that had been set in stone. He valiantly defeated invaders who came across the sea from Europe, and in one battle, single-handedly killed 960 men.
He unified his country from warring factions. He defended it against invaders. He led a band of knights, the Knights of the Round Table, who were famous for their adventures, for finding the Holy Grail and rescuing damsels in distress.
And at the heart of the legend lies Camelot, Arthur's magnificent castle.
Sometimes it's said to have been built and designed by Merlin the magician. It's impregnable, it never falls to invaders, having several rings of walls around a central keep with great gatehouses and towers on them.
It's got to be a suitable place for a glorious king and his glorious court. So it's rich, it's towering ramparts, it's horses which are clad in marvellous armours and people in beautiful robes, all being very gracious. It's a fabulous place.
But separating the legend of Camelot from real history was almost impossible, because people weren't writing about events in Dark Age Britain. In fact, there were no history books at all. So there's no record of King Arthur or Camelot at the time. The first mention of Arthur was not until the 9th century, 300 years after he was supposed to have lived, in a book called the Historia Brittonum.
Historia Brittonum told a story about a historical Arthur who conducted a series of battles against the Anglo-Saxons and emerged from these battles as the great victor. The Arthur of Historia Brittonum isn't a king. He is given a title, Dux Bellorum, which just means the battle leader or war leader.
However, there is no mention of Camelot in the Historia Brittonum. But academics reasoned that a great war leader must have led from a great castle of some kind. Camelot the castle doesn't appear until the 12th century, when a writer called Geoffrey of Monmouth first mentions it, as well as King Arthur's magnificent Round Table. He depicted Arthur's court as a place of chivalry, where the king treated all knights as equals.
Geoffrey of Monmouth concocted his History of the Kings of Britain. This has its centrepiece, the life and career of King Arthur. It's the first place where, for example, his wife, Queen Guinevere, is mentioned, his fabulous court, his amazing weapons.
Thanks to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the legend of King Arthur and Camelot was born.
The idea that Arthur had a great castle at his court became increasingly inextricable from the legend of Arthur and his knights, who could now be seated around a round table in a magnificent castle.
But because the King Arthur of legend existed in the Dark Ages, not the Middle Ages, when the texts were written, there was no way of proving through recorded history alone that he actually lived. In fact, because recorded history was so scant, it was not until the 20th century that archaeologists began piecing together the story of Dark Age Britain, after the Romans had left, a time of supposed chaos and barbarism. The idea formed that maybe archaeology could offer answers where the history books had failed. And just maybe, the remains of King Arthur's great castle could be found, buried deep beneath the ground. It became one of the century's great quests of popular archaeology. When Leslie Alcock was growing up, one of the first to pioneer the new search for what was now being called Arthur's Britain was archaeologist Raleigh Radford. For 5 years, he excavated around the ruins of Arthur's legendary birthplace and what some believed had been his castle, the Isle of Tintagel in Cornwall. What he found were pottery fragments from half a world away. Fragments that completely contradicted notions of the Dark Ages. Incredibly, these fragments were from storage jars that once contained the luxury goods of their day, like wine and olive oil.
The importance of the Mediterranean pottery is it actually showed links with the late Roman world. To have this material suddenly coming in and recognized as being from dated contexts in the Mediterranean, it was a bolt of light.
Radford's pottery showed that rather than being chaotic, leaderless, and isolated, some Dark Age Britons were actually very different.
Raleigh Radford, with these fragments of high-status pottery, was demonstrating that far from a lapse into barbarism, a break with Rome, Roman traditions, Roman civilization and culture had still been continued by the Britons in the face of the invading Saxons.
Radford's discoveries raised the extraordinary question. If Dark Age Britons were trading in luxury goods, who would they have been destined for, if not a king or leader of some kind? Could Tintagel have been a receiving port for a leader in the west of Britain, where King Arthur supposedly reigned? Because of Radford's pioneering work, excitement grew that maybe King Arthur really had existed, and that archaeology might even turn up something with his name on it. Perhaps the mighty sword Excalibur, or the remains of the Round Table, maybe even Camelot itself. Among those profoundly influenced by Radford's discoveries was Leslie Alcock, who in the 1950s was an assistant lecturer in archaeology at Cardiff University. On his first major dig, Alcock stumbled across the Dark Ages, almost by accident.
He started digging at a site called Dinas Powys, just outside Cardiff, and he did that as a thinking that he was going to be dealing essentially with an Iron Age site.
To his great surprise, Alcock was able to prove the Iron Age hill fort at Dinas Powys had been reoccupied in the Dark Ages, 1,000 years later. Alcock's excavation sparked an interest in post-Roman Britain that would define his career. By the 1960s, he became fascinated by new technology and techniques in archaeology that he believed might get to the bottom of the King Arthur myth once and for all. And what better way to start than finding the site of Arthur's legendary castle? But in a country with dozens of claims to be the original site of Camelot, working out where to dig was the biggest challenge of all.
For Dad, archaeology started very much before the digging. And what I always found was he was always looking in what was written. So much is taking the writings, which the historical record, and trying to find out if the historical record is true, or the places talked about in the historical record, can we identify them?
By examining every mention of the castle in the hundreds of stories that had been written about King Arthur, Alcock gradually picked out the main candidates. In the Middle Ages, Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Romance writers had said that Camelot lay in Caerleon in Wales. But that was thought to be based on the presence of a Roman amphitheatre that looked like a giant round table. Another possible candidate was found in Malory's Morte d'Arthur, published in 1485.
Sir Thomas Malory tried to ground his version of the Arthurian legends, and he's very clear that Camelot isn't Winchester.
Malory's theory was based on what was thought to be King Arthur's round table, which hangs in the Great Hall in Winchester. Carbon dating has in fact shown it was made for King Edward I, 700 years after King Arthur was supposed to have existed. But it was the writings of John Leyland, antiquary to King Henry VIII, that really piqued Alcock's interest. In 1542, Leyland wrote that a hill next to the village of South Cadbury in Somerset was the location of King Arthur's Camelot.
Leyland quite specifically dismisses all other candidates for Camelot except for Cadbury. He picks up the camel name from the local village names, Queen's Camel, places like that. Leyland sees in these very steep slopes and the ramparts there and the material, he gets almost orgiastic about how marvellous and how brilliant it all is.
Leyland said generations of locals had called the hill Camelot, a fact that had even drawn the attention of Alcock's mentor in India, Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
They said that their tradition was, they'd been told by their fathers and their grandfathers that King Arthur used to resort to this place, and it was known as Camelot or Camelot. That's the only real evidence we have, a local tradition. It's quite possible, I won't say more than that there is a little element of truth in this.
Local author Geoffrey Ashe, who had written several books on King Arthur, was so convinced that Cadbury could be Camelot, he approached Raleigh Radford, asking him to dig the site.
Cadbury is big. The enclosure at the top is 18 acres. Raleigh Radford was very much interested in Arthur, but when I asked him, could we excavate Cadbury, his response was, it's too big, I wouldn't know where to start.
But then Radford changed his mind, thanks to the findings of a dog walker on the hill at Cadbury, Mary Harefield.
She would go up there to walk her dog. The dog's name was Caesar. And she would walk about in ploughed-up fields there and poke about with the ferrule of an umbrella, which is the most elementary form of archaeology.
Mary Harefield turned up fragments of pottery that she thought was unusual and presented it to Raleigh Radford.
Mary Harefield's fragments were almost identical to Radford's finds at Tintagel.
Raleigh Radford, who had a vast experience of excavation throughout the West Country, immediately recognised as what he called Tintagelware. High-status tableware, high-status storage jars, fragments, from the Eastern Mediterranean.
So oil, wine and other luxuries had been sent up from Tintagel to Cadbury for someone of high status, exactly at the time that King Arthur was supposed to have lived. And these weren't the only clues that made Alcock and Radford want to excavate what could have been King Arthur's castle. Cadbury had clearly been fortified at some time, its banks ridged with earthen ramparts, possibly to protect a large army, just as Arthur was supposed to have led. And it was located just 11 miles from Glastonbury, with its Arthurian associations, and would have been on the front line in battles with invading Anglo-Saxons pushing west. Even the Ordnance Survey map used to call it Camelot. Radford, Alcock, and Wheeler staked their reputations on discovering Camelot at Cadbury. Failure to find it wasn't an option. In 1965, the Camelot Research Committee sat for the first time, tasked with the excavation of South Cadbury. Sir Mortimer Wheeler agreed to be president, offering advice from afar. Wheeler compared their quest to the late 19th century discovery of an ancient city, also thought to be entirely fictitious, until archaeology had proved otherwise.
One of the things which Sir Mortimer Wheeler was very, very keen to stress was that it was possible for archaeologists to discover legendary locations. He said if Heinrich Schliemann could find Troy, then why shouldn't English archaeologists be able to find Camelot?
The man who had started the search for King Arthur at Tintagel, Raleigh Radford, was the committee's chairman. The last surviving member of the committee today is Arthurian author Geoffrey Ashe.
Well, I was co-founder and I was secretary. I was the one who wasn't actually an archaeologist. I kept the minutes and things like that and handled the correspondence.
Leslie Alcock was the final committee member, selected as the outstanding Dark Age archaeologist of the day.
Leslie, because of his reputation as an excavator and his knowledge because of Dinner's powers, as well as his wider archaeological knowledge, was invited to come on board and appointed as Director of Excavations.
Unlike Radford, Alcock was undaunted by the scale of Cadbury.
I think it was the challenge of South Cadbury, which is what appealed to Leslie. It's a time of big projects. The BBC were digging Silbury Hill for the first time, and South Cadbury was going to be, if he got the money, a big project.
But on a hilltop of 18 acres, working out just where to start digging was in many ways more of a challenge than digging itself. Alcock was pioneering in his early use of geophysical surveying in deciding where to excavate.
It's often said that Leslie Alcock was one of the rock and roll archaeologists of his day. He was actually at the cutting edge of the white heat of technology. He used every technological means at his disposal to make sure that when they finally got picks and shovels out, they were digging in the right place.
Di Morgan Evans was a young supervisor on the search for Camelot, who was tasked with using the new technology.
One of the clinches there was the use of what became called the soil anomaly detector, and rather than calling it SAD, it was called the banjo.
17.
It looked like a banjo. It had a round disc at one end and a box at the other, connected by a long metal pole.
25.
What you had to do is you laid out 20-metre grids and you walked along calling out measurements at every few intervals.
31.
These were then written down by somebody. It became really repetitive, boring. It was awful.
But it wasn't just advanced technology Alcock deployed to work out where to dig. He was prepared to humour some of Geoffrey Ash's New Age beliefs.
I use dowsing, sometimes called water divining, but it needn't be only water. It can detect other things. Leslie very generously allowed me to do it. Now, I think this was brave of him because we were working with the media breathing down our necks, and it could so easily have been made ridiculous to say that they're digging with dowsing rods.
Back at base, Alcock began to analyse the data from his geophysical surveys. He could tell the site was originally Iron Age, but could it have been reoccupied and refortified at the time of King Arthur? The banjo readings seemed to suggest so. There was only one way to know for sure.
When you're faced with a mass of preliminary evidence, there's only one way to resolve the problems and to sort it out, and that's to excavate.
But a dig of this scale needed a lot of money. The Camelot Research Committee had to somehow raise £15,000 to finance the excavation, the equivalent to almost £250,000 today. However, the committee knew just using the very word Camelot was guaranteed to get people's attention. In America, Camelot the musical had been the biggest show on Broadway. President Kennedy's Inner Circle had been named after Camelot. The name Camelot was on everyone's lips, capturing imaginations on both sides of the Atlantic.
Using the name Camelot was incredibly significant. Leslie Alcock was very keen to popularise archaeology, and the idea of King Arthur and Camelot might lead to an appreciation of history in these dark ages was important to him as a democratic way of explaining to beyond the elite of academia exactly what he was digging up.
With donations from the BBC, the Pilgrims Trust in America, and an exclusive deal with the Observer newspaper, finally the committee raised enough to begin the dig. But none of the archaeologists knew that one of the committee had personally taken a huge financial risk to ensure the excavation could proceed.
We were aware of the money constraints we had to spend. Leslie at times would get very twitchy, which doesn't surprise me because I only learnt later on that he, at one stage, he'd actually put up his house as security.
Leslie Alcock was a brilliant manager, a brilliant organiser, and considering the troubles he was up against, he was a very courageous man.
The dig for Camelot took place on the top of the hill and on the southern side, where a major trench was dug from top to bottom.
It was a time of really quite high tension because there was a need to deliver. It was a funny mixture of excitement, tension, and it used to come away absolutely wrung out and feeling like a wet dishcloth at the end of it.
Alcock's team catalogued all their discoveries. And hopes were dramatically raised when someone found an artifact in the shape of a letter.
All the letters it had to be in the alphabet, it was the letter A, and that, of course, caused huge excitement at the time.
The A had to stand for Arthur, surely proof of Cadbury's claims to Camelot. Alcock was so pleased with the find, he persuaded Sir Mortimer Wheeler to come and see Arthur's brooch. But after careful analysis, the A is discovered to be a Roman brooch, dating from before the Dark Ages. It couldn't possibly be Arthurian. Despite the setback, Alcock's team pressed on, their morale boosted by regular appearances of Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
He said to Leslie Alcock, "Dig there." Alcock dutifully did dig there and found things. Sir Mortimer was quite right, but he had an instinct by then, you know.
Alcock's other great mentor and collaborator, Raleigh Radford, would regularly visit the dig to check on developments.
Radford was sort of almost an amateur archaeologist in his own way, as a gentleman of independent means, although he was taken very seriously in some ways.
Raleigh Radford was an inspiration to a whole succeeding generation of archaeologists, and not surprisingly, Leslie Alcock started digging at a lot of the sites that Raleigh Radford had first drawn people's attention to.
Another regular visitor to the site was Alcock's son, John.
I think South Cadbury was just very special. When you looked at the side of a trench, you're talking layer after layer of history. There's my dad standing beside saying to me, well, that's the medieval layer, that's the Dark Age layer.
The dig for Camelot was getting huge publicity. After 6 weeks of excavations, Alcock appeared on the BBC to explain their progress.
Well, we've now reached the end of our work in 1966, and both the traces of buildings that we found and the finds particularly give us every reason to believe that we've got a good site here of the 6th century AD in particular.
By now, interest in the dig had spread beyond Britain. Alcock needed to raise more money for further excavations and was given a huge boost by an unexpected source.
One evening, I was at home, the telephone rang, I picked it up, and the voice said, "This is Warner Brothers, where was Camelot?"
Camelot, the Broadway musical, was being turned into a major motion picture, starring Richard Harris and Vanessa Redgrave.
They wanted this for the film, you see. They were going to put a map in the film. So I said, it was in Somerset. Well, of course I said that. That's my one contribution to Hollywood.
For Leslie Alcock, Hollywood's interest was another great marketing opportunity.
You're talking about a time when Camelot had come out, when the Arthurian legend was a fascination to everyone, and my dad saw that by pushing that side of it, that this could be Camelot, he would get money to do the serious excavation. And what's more, by going to America, he could tap into a much bigger market with more money.
In the summer of 1967, the search for Camelot started up again. Thanks to the film, the committee raised enough funds, principally from America, to continue digging for another 3 summers.
Well, it's the time when flowers are coming from San Francisco. You've got Sgt. Pepper and Lonely Heart Club Band. It's sort of the hippie era. It was all high degree of interest, and with the television cameras and the newspapers, and that it was all very, very buzzy.
The dig for Camelot went on for a further 3 years. As it drew to a close in 1970, Alcock made 2 extraordinary breakthroughs. His team found a late Roman coin of Dark Age origin, buried in the fortifications, that proved that the ramparts dated almost exactly to the time Arthur was supposed to have existed.
The eureka moment, if you like, where they realised that there was some substance to the legends which had got them digging, was discovering that this wasn't only an Iron Age Celtic site that maybe some Saxons had lived on top of, but in the actual Arthurian period had been fortified, had been turned into an actual castle.
And if it was a Dark Age castle, who was to say it couldn't be Camelot? But then Alcock made an even more remarkable discovery: the remains of a great hall. A hall littered with Dark Age pot shards, almost certainly used for banqueting by a great ruler at the time of King Arthur. Maybe even Arthur himself.
At South Cadbury, there was a gigantic hall, a hall at least 20 feet across, that could easily have fitted something of the size and scale of the Round Table at Winchester, for example.
It was proof, surely, that Camelot lay at South Cadbury.
Here was my dad saying, actually, I'm the guy with the physical evidence. I've got the great big hall. You know, I've got something that is far more likely to be Arthur's Camelot than anything anyone else has found.
If the castle was surrounded by Dark Age fortifications and contained a great leader's feasting hall, it seemed King Arthur really could have ruled from Cadbury.
Are you yourself convinced that these were the defences of King Arthur himself?
Well, in my most cautious mood, I would only go this far to say that if it isn't Arthur himself, then it's another great military leader so like him that it doesn't make tuppence of difference.
Alcock and his team were triumphant. They basked in the knowledge that they had shown the legend of King Arthur and Camelot to be real after all. But, little by little, doubts about the dig at Cadbury started to emerge. Academics began to question Alcock's methods and his evidence.
There's nothing at South Cadbury which would make one believe that there was an Arthur in the 6th century than one did without it. In terms of finding evidence for a historical Arthur, it completely failed.
Every generation of archaeologists challenges those that went before it. They challenge their assumptions and they challenge their findings. That's the discipline of archaeology.
Believing that a war leader called Arthur led the Britons in their heroic defeat of the Anglo-Saxons in the 6th century is akin to believing that an Englishman in a dinner jacket called James Bond defeated the Soviet Union in the late 20th century.
The evidence for King Arthur's Great Hall on Cadbury was highly dubious at best, they said. It wasn't big enough for a round table at all.
It gets called the Great Hall, but to be honest, it's actually quite a small hall. An awful lot is placed on the shoulders of a really rather modest building.
Not only was there no archaeological evidence, even the historical texts which Alcock had based his research on were questionable, to say the least. The new skeptics dismantled the written foundation stone of Alcock's Arthurian claims. Rather than being a history, they said, the Historia Brittonum, which first mentioned Arthur, was a work of 9th century propaganda and had its chronology of the Dark Ages all wrong.
David Dunville's work in the 1970s completely discredited most of the evidence that Alcock and others supporting the idea of a historical Arthur had used. Obviously, this had a pretty negative impact on the credibility of Alcock's work.
Some hinted that Alcock had committed historical heresy. He had tried to give credibility to works of fiction rather than establish the truth. Even the very idea of Arthur, the heroic Briton, battling invading Anglo-Saxons was misconceived, they said.
Since the 1970s, the relationship between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons has been increasingly reassessed, and we would now tend to think of that relationship as much more complicated and nuanced, if you like. Instead of continuous warfare and hostility, some Britons and some Anglo-Saxons lived peacefully side by side.
By the end of the 1990s, no serious historian dared associate the Dark Ages with a real King Arthur again, including Alcock himself. He had the great sense, rare among myth hunters, to accept that he was probably wrong.
I'm not aware of my dad taking criticisms hard. He always saw there was another argument. He always had some doubts as to whether Arthur existed. He always was prepared to accept there were other sides to the argument.
Despite his mistakes at Cadbury, in 1973, Alcock became the first professor of archaeology at Glasgow University and excavated Dark Age hill forts in Scotland with huge success. Alcock's legacy was not only furthering our understanding of Dark Age Britain, but also the lasting impact he had on the archaeologists he taught.
Without a doubt, Alcock's work encouraged an interest in Dark Age archaeology among a succeeding generation of archaeologists, most of whom are active today.
Leslie was a great teacher, a great academic, and I think he deserves more recognition than probably he gets. And I think in due course his contributions will be fully recognised, not least amongst the hundreds of students that he trained and sent out into the archaeological world.
We can't underestimate Leslie Alcock's contribution to the world of archaeology. This was a remarkable step change in the way that archaeology and the public interacted, and it's a legacy that we're still living under.
As for South Cadbury, the hill fort is now barely even signposted. Home just to cows and walkers, its association with King Arthur, once again, buried deep beneath the ground. And although he may not have found Camelot, Alcock had discovered the fortified remains of a great leader.
We certainly didn't find the Camelot of romance as you found it in the Middle Ages. We did find that the hill had been a great fortified place at exactly the right time.
And we now know South Cadbury Hill Fort was one of Britain's largest and most significant ancient settlements, occupied for 4,000 years, from Neolithic times until the Middle Ages.
Leslie Alcock's excavation at South Cadbury was, in many ways, a great success. It found an outstandingly useful sequence of occupation from a British hill fort.
And where does that leave the legend of King Arthur? Was he just a myth, after all?
I personally think that Arthur did exist, that as a Dux Bellorum he was a great military leader. Where he was, when he was, I can't be sure.
I think we can say that there was a real person. He is called King of the Britons.
Every nation needs its foundation myth, and Britain's is the legend of King Arthur and Camelot, a legend that lives on. Joan of Arc is France's most famous patron saint. Burned at the stake, her remains were said to have been lost, thrown into the River Seine, until in 1867, her bones appeared out of the blue.
It's a bit like crime scene investigation. You have the remains. Who do they belong to?
Some thought it was a hoax, others the real deal. France's leading forensic pathologist, Dr. Philippe Charlier, became fascinated by this mysterious and macabre cold case.
They are not just bones for me, they are patients.
A detective tale that tested Charlier's expertise to the limit. The autopsy of an international icon, where science meets myth.
It connects you to the past in a very unexpected way.
This is the story of Charlier's quest to find the truth behind the relics that could be Saint Joan of Arc. Paris, France, 2006. Dr. Philippe Charlier was a pathologist. His patients were the city's dead, dissecting their bodies for clues about why they died. But he was also France's most famous forensic sleuth, dubbed the Indiana Jones of graveyards. He couldn't resist the coldest cases, long-dead kings, queens, and mistresses, whose deaths were shrouded in mystery.
I'm a physician, first of all, not an archeologist or anthropologist. So they are not just bones for me, they are patients. And I look at them as if it would be anybody in the subway or on the streets, but dead, of course.
His patient files include the English King Richard the Lionheart and the French King Henry IV, but all the remains, however small, held secrets from the past.
Even just a tiny bone, for me, it's a patient. All these bodies are, for me, patients, and when I look at their bones, I'm just looking like in a patient's file, like a historian book.
Charlier was destined to become a myth hunter, and it all began on a trip to the Italian city of Pompeii when he was just 7 years old. A volcano had erupted in 79 AD, burying buildings in boiling ash. People were frozen in time.
I remember the cadaver of a woman, and this was very important for me because I was facing not a skeleton, but the three-dimensional form of a dead individual, and I wanted to make this individual speaking to me.
By 10 years old, Charlier had found a human skull, someone who died some 1,300 years before. He wanted the dead to tell him their story, to speak to him through their remains. So he went on to forge a career in medicine. As a forensic pathologist, he knew he could search for the truth behind history's most famous deaths. In 2006, Charlier had just closed his latest case. He was returning the medieval remains of a king's mistress to a provincial museum in Chinon, central France, when by chance he spotted his next patient.
50 centimeters close to these remains were the relics of the so-called Joan of Arc.
Charlier had discovered a long-forgotten box of bones, but these were no ordinary remains. Legend said they belonged to France's patron saint, Joan of Arc. But how did they find their way to Chinon? Charlier learnt the bones trace back to Paris in 1867. Vast swathes of the capital were being knocked down for one of the most ambitious urban transformations ever attempted.
Dr. Charlier wanted to know where they'd come from and found out that in 1867 the attic of a pharmacy had been cleared out and these remains had been found.
Near the Place de la République, a pharmacist was clearing his shop's attic before demolition when he claimed to make an extraordinary discovery. jars filled with bones, a textile fragment, and a lid inscribed with a message: the remains of Joan of Arc. The Catholic Church took an immediate interest.
The Roman Catholic Church had the remains examined to see whether they could tell whether they were Joan of Arc's. They sort of accepted that they were, but it wasn't a definitive conclusion.
The clergy took the remains to Chinon for safekeeping, where they eventually landed up in the local museum.
So these relics were then left on a shelf for nearly 150 years until they were rediscovered by Charlier.
Charlier had little evidence to work with. A broken piece of human rib, a fragment of vertebrae from a spine, the end of a cat's thigh bone, a curious scrap of fabric, and what looked like lumps of charcoal. He faced one of his most difficult investigations, and he'd need a crack team if he was to solve the case.
It's a bit like CSI, crime scene investigation, using a whole range of different experts, many different methods of analysis to determine whether, in this case, relics belonged to Joan of Arc.
Yes, it was interesting to study these bones, which were absolutely black and that could have been burnt.
The blackened bones instantly reminded Charlier of the history lesson every French child learned in school.
Joan of Arc is a peasant girl, and she emerges out of nowhere, really, of almost total obscurity, and erupts onto the historical scene in the most unexpected of ways. She starts to hear voices, and these voices are those of the saints. The voices tell her that she is the Virgin who will save France, and that her mission is to ensure that the true King of France, who is the Dauphin Charles, will become crowned.
It was 1422. France was in the grip of a power struggle with England. That went on so long, it became known as the 100 Years' War. The French King Charles VI had just died. The English were determined to stop his son, the Dauphin, Charles, from taking the crown. In 1429, Joan rode to the Dauphin's court at the fortress of Chinon. She told the French prince of her quest to defeat the English, hand him the throne, and restore peace.
We don't know exactly what she told the Dauphin in secret. What was the sign that she gave which convinced him and many of them that she was the true Virgin who was going to save France?
Whatever she said, it worked. Joan became his military advisor. She was just 16 years old.
She seems to be quite willing to adopt the role of a warrior. And this is very unusual. She is someone who seems to be able to take on military command. She bears a banner, a standard, which is her emblem and symbol.
She thwarted the English armies in battle and saw the Dauphin crowned King Charles VII of France. But a year later, in 1430, in the midst of a battle, Joan was captured by pro-English French troops. Then betrayed by her king, who refused to pay her ransom. Charles VII knew she'd become a dangerous liaison. The church was convinced the voices she heard weren't the saints, but the devil.
She is no longer worth supporting. He must not be seen to have owed anything least of all his kingdom or his crown, to somebody who is accused of being a heretic.
Joan was imprisoned. She refused to renounce the voices she heard, certain they were the word of God. The church wasn't impressed.
She confuses and disconcerts her interrogators. She treats them in what they regard as an extremely disrespectful way, telling them that they can't have an answer now, they have to wait for a fortnight because her voices will have spoken by then and she will then be able to communicate God's message to them, which, if the clergy are not part of that communication with God, is heretical.
A show trial found her guilty of heresy, and there was no leniency in the sentence.
The normal punishment for the heretic who is obdurate and refuses to recant or abjure their heresy, which is the dreadful, dreadful punishment of burning at the stake.
On the 30th of May, 1431, Joan was tied to a stake above a pyre of wood in Rouen market square. A vast crowd was said to have gathered to watch the spectacle. The pyre was lit. It took 3 attempts to burn her body to ash.
What was remaining of the poor girl was deposited as ashes into the River Seine. It was highly important that there should be no relics left.
"575 years later, Charlier gazed at a labelled jar. It said, 'Remains found under the pyre of Joan of Arc, Virgin of Orleans.' Could her body have survived the fire? For Philippe Charlier, this was the opportunity of a lifetime to examine relics rumoured to be France's most famous daughter. As a pathologist who'd analysed anonymous human body parts found by the police, Charlier knew one diagnostic test reigns supreme.
DNA analysis has been described as being the silver bullet to all questions, particularly in the past.
The double helix, DNA, was Charlier's best chance of proving the bones were Joan of Arc. A molecule found in all animal and plant cells, DNA is encoded with vital genetic information, passed down from one generation to another.
If Charlier could actually get preserved DNA out of the human remains, it would be possible, 1, to determine the sex of the person represented, and 2, to compare the DNA profile with living descendants.
Charlier knew DNA could last in human remains for hundreds, even thousands of years. So he sent bone samples to forensic genetics experts. If the remains were female, he planned to obtain DNA from her relatives alive today to identify a genetic link with the relic bones.
DNA analysis has really been around only about 25 years for looking at archaeological skeletons. 1989 was the first time DNA was extracted from bone.
Charlier awaited the results. If the bones were male, it'd mark the sudden end to his quest.
Would have been a male, we would have concluded that these remains were absolutely not these of Joan of Arc.
Then Charlier got the call. It was bad news. The scientists had failed to extract any DNA. His plan to test her relatives for a genetic match now lay in tatters. The reason why there was no DNA was a mystery. But was it possible intense heat, like a burning pyre, could have destroyed it?
So there are 2 reasons why the DNA wouldn't have survived, and that would be that it didn't survive full stop, or that it was destroyed. It's very unlikely to get preserved DNA out of bone that has been cremated.
Charlier suspected high-tech science might not give him the breakthroughs he'd need to crack this cold case. To unravel the mystery of the relics of Joan of Arc, he knew he'd have to think outside the box. He had a radical idea, something never attempted before. And he'd need one of France's most highly trained noses.
I am a perfumer, I create perfumes, I smell so many things in life, and I have a passion for nice odors like flowers, fruits, spices, woods, etc. And suddenly you have someone calling you and say, "Oh, hello Jean-Michel, I am a doctor, I work in a hospital, and I am investigating on the supposed relics of Joan of Arc. Can you help me?"
I wanted to use noses of perfumers, which are professional noses and quite artistic one also, in order to smell these remains and to know if they have been burned or not.
To smell the relics, to see if there's evidence of burning, I think is wonderful. Use any test you can.
The sense of smelling is really about detecting molecules, volatile molecules that are here in the air. Sometimes quite a few molecules are enough to be detected. They come into your nose, and your nose captures them and sends an olfactive information to your brain.
Like a sommelier's palate for the complex taste of wine, Jean-Michel Durier's senses were finely tuned to sniff odors with precision. He'd be the first to put the smell of the relics under scrutiny. He met Charlier at the hospital laboratory. Some of the bottles hadn't been opened for at least 30 years. Charlier hoped the scent would be concentrated enough for a result.
We were just, placing our nose on the bottle very carefully, as if also, this dead person would be still alive and we don't want to bother her too much. So, excuse me, madam, but can I smell your burnt bones? That was a bit strange.
Durier sniffed the blackened 10-centimeter long rib fragment.
Knowing the history of Joan of Arc, I was expecting maybe to smell a burnt odor. And I was surprised because I didn't smell anything burnt.
There was no trace scent of fire, but Durier did detect a faint but dense aroma, evidence that the relics were old. Scent is made of molecules called notes, which have different weights. Top notes give the strongest smell, but they're so lightweight they evaporate away in minutes. Bottom notes are the heaviest scent molecules, lingering for hours, perhaps even centuries.
What we call the top notes are the volatile notes, were completely disappeared. So what I was smelling was more into what we call the dry down or the bottom note, very heavy and soft type of note.
And the bottom note smelled curiously of vanilla.
I am smelling a sort of vanillic note. Is that possible? Is that any possible that a burnt bone can smell like vanilla?
A vanilla scent was an important clue. It's linked to the sweet smell of bodies as they decay.
Vanillin is in direct relationship with decomposition and putrefaction. So these remains are still continuing their decomposition and putrefaction process.
But the smell of decay didn't rule out that the body had been burnt on a wood pyre. The relics could still be Joan of Arc.
Just because there was a smell of vanilla doesn't necessarily mean that the body was not cremated, because cremated bone can degrade following the cremation.
Charlier needed to check if the bones had been burned, to look for direct evidence of exposure to the intense heat of fire. But to see it, he'd need X-ray vision. He called on radiologists to put the relics through their CT scanner, normally used to analyze living bodies, organs, and tumors.
It's an X-ray technique. It produces slices, which are images through the object or the body, and then those images are then reconstructed into a 3D picture.
Charlier wanted to scan the bone fragments from different angles to generate a 3D model of the bones, revealing the inside and the outside surfaces in minute detail. And he had a clever idea how to identify any evidence of burning on the relics.
Dr. Charlier did have control samples, particularly from victims of burning, so that he could actually compare what he saw in the relics with the modern victims.
The body is cremated on public places or in a car, in private place. It's much more close to Joan of Arc death process.
Charlier would check both the relics and modern bones for cracks in their structure, created when bones are exposed to temperatures above 70 degrees Celsius and the bone's collagen starts to disintegrate.
Well, we wanted to know if these women have been burnt with the identification of little fractures or trauma.
The 3D models were generated on screen, and Charlier had his answer.
We saw that there were absolutely no cremation sign on the screen.
The results suggested the relics had not been burned, but Charlier wondered if the Joan of Arc legend could explain why. It takes half a ton of wood and 5 hours to cremate a body. And the history book said it took 3 attempts to burn Joan of Arc's corpse. She died in the first fire, probably from carbon monoxide poisoning, but the flames had not destroyed her body.
The body was quite intact. Only the extremities of the fingers and toes were cremated. So the English people and authorities wanted to burn it a second time.
A second pyre was lit. Joan's arms, head, and legs were burned away, but not her torso, containing the wettest organs, her lungs, heart, liver, and intestines.
It's possible after the second burning that there was just the torso left, maybe because that's got the most moisture in it, and therefore a third burning was needed to get rid of the rest of the body.
The relic bones would have come from her torso. Charlier wondered if they could have been saved from the third fire, which finally incinerated her body.
We had two possible explanations about the conservation of little relics of Joan of Arc. The first one, that as the pyre was not on the ground but upstairs, it may be possible that some bones passed from the support down to the ground.
Could the fallen bones have been saved by the jostling crowd? Or had Joan of Arc's corpse reacted to fire just like Hindu pyre funerals and modern cremations? Had the torso exploded?
The other possibility was possible explosions of the body of Joan of Arc. We got a lot of gas that grew inside the trunk, and the pressure grows, and after, of course, it explodes because the lungs and the ribs cannot support such high pressure.
It is a known phenomenon that bodies do explode during the burning process, so his second explanation could be true.
But Charlier's theory of why the bones hadn't burned didn't account for the radiologist's second discovery. The bones were permeated by a mysterious dark substance that had once been very hot.
To infiltrate the bone, the black substance would have needed to be liquefied, which suggests that there was some high temperature involved somewhere. Dr. Charlier had to look under a microscope to find out what was actually in it.
Charlier scraped samples of the black coating from the relics. If the bones had been exposed to fire, Charlier thought he might see charcoal particles under the microscope.
He found a lot of things, including red blood cells, vegetable fibres, a dog hair, and various other things, but no charcoal.
But Charlier's analysis did reveal the substance was a resin.
We saw that it was a mixture of organic putrefacted material and also a large quantity of pollens.
Pollen grains and fungal spores, which then gave him the result that this was actually a resin from pine tree.
Charlier knew pine sap resin had been used for millennia to preserve bodies. If the remains were Joan of Arc, had someone soaked the relics in resin to prevent decay? Charlier wanted to know if all the relics were coated in the same resin. Did it hold any secrets about where or when the bones had been preserved? So he called on a long-time collaborator at the Hospital Lariboisière, Paris. Toxicologist Dr. Joel Poupon.
I know Philippe Charlier for a long time, more than 10 years, and when he wants something, he will have it. And so he is very persuasive, and you cannot resist, in fact. For him, all is possible.
Unlike Charlier, Poupon's patients are usually alive. He looks for the chemical traces of poisoning or certain diseases in their bodies. But he can find elements in archaeological remains too. He's helped solve some of Charlier's most complex cases. But an alleged saint, permeated by resin, was a first.
All the relics, the bones were covered with a very dark substance coating. And it was very intriguing. So we wanted to know if the substance was the same for all the samples and what it was exactly.
Poupon's experiment would reveal the exact chemical makeup of the resin covering each of the relics. Were they all coated with the same substance?
They also put in 2 lots of control samples, one of which was 2 bones from modern cremations, and the other was a piece of dried skin.
Charlier demanded absolute secrecy about the case. Poupon wasn't to breathe a word.
I didn't know who were working on it, and so we were supposed not to talk about it to the press or the media.
To identify the elements in the resin, Poupon had to dissolve the samples in acid, heated to 5,000 degrees.
So you put your sample with the acid in the microwave, you heat, and all is dissolved. Not exactly the same used in your kitchen, but the principle is the same.
Then Poupon ran the liquid through his mass spectrometer, which would identify and count the atoms in the samples. Charlier wanted the results straight away.
You know, Philippe Charlier is very impatient, and especially for this kind of very important study, he wants to know very quickly the results. So he phoned me and Joel, what are the results? I need it tomorrow.
The outcome was clear. Poupon proved the relics were all coated with the same resin. But this group included the anonymous skin fragment too.
It seemed there were 2 different groupings according to his analyses. One was the modern cremations, and the second grouping was the relics and the skin sample.
The relics and the skin sample were loaded with the metals iron and phosphorus, further proof the bones had decayed, not been cremated.
So the high levels of phosphorus and iron in the relics and the skin indicates the decay process that goes on in the muscles and skin.
The modern bones had a different chemical composition. There was no link with the relic resin. Now, Charlier revealed the source of the skin fragment.
So then what Charlier said to Poupon was, well, actually, that skin sample was from an Egyptian mummy.
Charlier had sent the skin sample to test a secret idea, that the relics were coated with a resin recipe invented by the ancient Egyptians. He was right. It was a major breakthrough in the case.
The blackish mixture was, of course, bitumen and kind of balm deposed during the embalming process. These results confirmed us that we had a kind of unity. The coating was exactly the same for all the samples.
Charlier was determined to find out whether the relics could be Joan of Arc, and he knew of a test that could help him peer back into the past. Zurich, Switzerland, scientists at the Ion Beam Physics Laboratory were world experts at dating human remains by analyzing a radioactive molecule, carbon-14.
In a way, we are radioactive just by nature. Our atmosphere, our planet is exposed to cosmic radiation, and these high energetic cosmic particles finally ends up in all living organisms, also in our body.
Carbon-14 is found in every cell in our bodies, and as soon as we die, it works like a ticking clock. Because it's radioactive, carbon-14 decays at a known rate, so scientists would count the number of the molecules left in the relic bones to tell Charlier when the person had died.
We wanted to know, of course, the datation of the relics. We wanted to know if it had exactly the same period as Joan of Arc.
As soon as we die, we can't replace the C14 atoms anymore. And at that moment, the clock starts running. And from this, we can calculate directly the age. The cleaned sample material, we first burn it to carbon dioxide, purify the gas, and then we reduce it again to graphite. And this little graphite powder is pressed into these bullets.
The bullet-like capsules were loaded into the accelerator. Charlier wanted to find out if the relics were medieval or not. But he also wanted to know their geographic origin. So he called on textile historian Christophe Moulerat to analyze the fabric found in the jar.
Philippe called me to say, Christophe, I've got a fragment from the relics of Joan d'Arc. He wants to extract the more information possible from everything.
It'd be one of the most perplexing cases Moulerat had ever faced.
Analysing the textile was really important. It potentially can show you when it was actually manufactured, where it was manufactured, what the actual cloth was.
He had just a small scrap of fabric to analyse, which was coated on one side with the embalming resin found on the bones.
The textile was a fragile 10 centimeters length part of tissue with a blackish and brownish coloration and black formations incrusted on one part of the textile.
Moulerat wanted to know what the material was made of, then its thread count, to see if it matched medieval fabrics.
So when I study the thread, I find it's linen, but the material was very fine also, very good quality. When I make the count of the thread, I find 24 centimeters.
The fabric was flax linen with 24 threads per centimetre square, a fine fabric, widespread in Europe for the last 1,000 years. But as he looked under the microscope, something strange caught Moulerat's expert eye. He knew that from the 7th century, European thread was twisted in a Z direction. But the relic thread had an opposite twist, like an S.
The thread used to make the textile was always in Z direction. And in this textile, it's S. It's opposite direction. So it's very strange.
He expected a Z twist to the thread and he found an S twist. So he had to start thinking where that textile might have come from.
There was no match with European-made fabric, but Mulhara had seen this twist before.
All the textile from the Middle East, all the material is in S direction.
Could the fabric have been exported to France from the Middle East in the 15th century? Could the strange cat femur found in the relics give any further clues? Charlier had heard that in the late Middle Ages, some people believed the devil could transform himself into a cat. They were said to be associated with witchcraft and heresy, and rumored to have been thrown on pyres when witches were burned. At least 12,000 heretics died at the stake in Europe and America between 1300 and 1800 AD. But up to 100,000 could have been killed. Joan of Arc's death was the most well-documented of them all, but there had been no mention of a cat.
When we saw the femur, first of all, we were not sure that it was a cat, and we wanted to show it to a specialist.
Archaeozoologist Marie Patou-Matisse measured the femur.
Bat Matisse was looking at a fragment of this cat's femur. People who study human remains have an easy job because there's just one species there. So you want to know what species it is, you want to know what bone it is. You may be able to determine how old the animal was when it died. And she was able to determine the total length, if she had the whole femur, from analysing it. And she decided that on the basis of that, this femur did not come from a European domestic cat and may have come from somewhere like Egypt.
It took 4 weeks for the carbon dating team to complete their tests and to analyse the data. Charlier had a clear result.
For this specific object, we measured the radiocarbon age of 2,355 years. This goes back in the ancient times. It was from the 7th century to the 3rd century before Christ.
The bones were between 1,000 and 600 years older than the date when Joan of Arc died. The question mark that hung over the relics led to one answer. They were a fake.
These remains are not these of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc existed, but her remains are not in the glass jar.
So we now have the final results of the analysis of these relics, that they don't belong to Joan of Arc. But who do they belong to?
The cat femur was from a large breed found in Egypt, and the fabric twist linked to the Middle East. The bones had been embalmed with a resin just like the recipe used to embalm ancient Egyptians. And the carbon date proved the person lived in late antiquity, the time of the last pharaohs. All the evidence suggested Charlier's patient was an Egyptian mummy.
If these remains are not the good one, it's much more interesting to know when it was created, from which artifact, and what was the manner of making this forgery.
For Charlier, his investigation was far from over. He was determined to get to the bottom of why this elaborate forgery had been made. Charlier had been drawn into the mystery by the handwritten label, proclaiming the relics were Joan of Arc. Could the text and the glass jars give up the last clues he needed to wrap up the case? Antique expert Robert Montezuma took a look.
The cover is still intact with an inscription on it. It's a kind of parchment with an inscription handmade on it. Reste trouvé sous le bûcher de Jeanne d'Arc Pucelle d'Orléans.
The text read, "Remains found under the pyre of Joan of Arc, Virgin of Orléans." The Virgin was a name Joan had used for herself in the 15th century, but the moniker had been revived by the French poet Voltaire in his 1755 poem mocking her purity. There was another clue in the glass itself. The jars were hand-blown and cut off at the base, designed in the 18th century for scientists. Perhaps not out of place in a pharmacy.
The glass jar has been broken very recently, almost 40 or 30 years ago, not before. But the jar was not dating back from Joan of Arc, but it was from the 18th century. And the inscription was very recent, but with an archaic style.
The forger had attempted antiquated writing, but it didn't fool the expert. It certainly wasn't medieval, nor 18th century, but a 19th century hand. Instead of finding the relics, Charlier wondered if the pharmacist had made the forgery in 1867, putting some mummy remains in glass jars and passing them off as Joan of Arc. But why go to all of that effort? The relics had turned up when French society was in the midst of a radical transformation. In 1456, Joan's reputation had been restored when a retrial cleared her of heresy. By the 1860s, she'd become a symbol used by three groups who were hijacking her reputation to gain power.
One has to remember the extreme fierceness of the controversies that divide France in the late 19th century over the separation of church and state. And Joan of Arc becomes a symbol in that conflict. On the one hand, the Republicans and the Socialist Party claiming Joan of Arc as a figure from the people, triumphing over the oppressive authority of the church. On the other extreme, you have Catholic monarchists who see her as enshrining the notion of a Catholic, most Christian kingship in France.
After Joan's death, a cult in her memory had developed, and by the mid-19th century, calls were being made for her sainthood. Then her remains turned up, out of the blue.
A little pharmacist, maybe he makes a kind of false reliquary, and he presents this to the beatification process in Orléans, saying, "Look what I found in my home. Look at that. These are the remains of Joan of Arc."
The church declared the remains might be real, and they were sent to Chinon for safekeeping. In 1920, almost 500 years after her death, Joan was canonized. Later, she became France's patron saint, a revered heroine. For Charlier, the motivation to make the forgery made sense. But to close the case file, he still had to crack the last part of the mystery. How had an Egyptian mummy ended up in a Parisian pharmacy attic?
Mummies have been used for therapeutic activities since the medieval ages.
In medieval medicine, parts of mummies were used to treat various ailments, particularly associated with bleeding. One example being treatment of hemorrhoids or piles.
Mummy medicine had lost its appeal before the 19th century, but it was said the building had been an apothecary for centuries. Could a mummy have been left in the attic since medieval times? Or had the body found its way there far more recently?
I think there is probably a very strong case for saying that these Egyptian relics arrived in France in the course of the 19th century as a result of the Napoleonic campaigns. The Napoleonic wars were productive of the looting and pillaging of all kinds of sites. Mummified corpses of Egyptians were in fact coming into France in quite considerable numbers. There are plenty of good reasons why mummified cats, given the status of the cat in Egyptian religion, should be found among these mummified collections. These are not medieval relics.
Charlier's quest was complete. He'd identified his patient, an ancient Egyptian. The team had carried out their analysis in secret. But 1 year on, it was time to let the cat and the mummy out of the bag.
At the end of the study, when the results were presented to the press and the media, it made a lot of sound in France, and all the people, the press and the journals were talking about it.
I was really expecting Dr. Charlier to find that these relics were genuine. We had TVs, we had magazines, we had interviews, etc., and suddenly it became like yes, you know, an important information.
Charlier's extraordinary discovery made headline news, and the mummy remains were sent back to the fortress of Chinon for public display. The bones weren't Joan, but for Charlier and his team, it didn't matter.
We've seen from this study that you can get such detailed information from the smallest of fragments. I think showed how science can help unravel mysteries of the past.
Some people were disappointed by the result of this investigation. On the other hand, I think that the simple memory of her is probably enough.
Joan's memory will remain for a very long time. The qualities of human courage, fortitude, endurance, that is really what's made her reputation. She's absolutely exceptional, remarkable figure. The relics are far, far less important than the life story.
It doesn't change anything to the person of Joan of Arc, which is unique, which is beautiful, which is exceptional. These are false relics. It doesn't change anything to the personage of Joan of Arc.
Charlier's investigation hadn't found Joan, but he had busted one of France's most intriguing myths. The treasure of the mighty Aztec emperor Montezuma. When Spanish conquistadors invaded, the breathtaking haul vanished without a trace. Legend says the riches were taken far to the north, to the fabled land of Aztlan. The quest for Aztec gold began with a drifter who believed it was buried near a small town in America.
It's here. I believe that Montezuma's treasure is here someplace.
He was followed by others who came in search of the treasure.
They were seeing all kinds of ghostly figures.
Have they awoken an army of Aztec warriors?
There's people who've lost their lives.
And condemned this town to live under the curse of the fearsome Montezuma.
There is a curse that's keeping people from finding this treasure.
The quest started almost 100 years ago. One summer's day in 1914, a dusty old prospector cycled along Johnson Canyon in Utah, in the southwest of America. His name was Freddie Crystal, and he was in a hurry to get to a town called Kanab.
I am sure that the people of Kanab thought that Freddie sounded a bit mad, and he looked a bit mad. Wild-eyed and crazy hair, unshaven, not the typical person that comes into town.
And Freddie Crystal certainly had a wild tale to tell. He told the people of Kanab that the treasure of Montezuma was buried near their town. If they'd help him find it, they'd all get a cut. It wasn't the sort of story these no-nonsense folk were used to hearing.
The bulk of the people who lived in Kanab were members of the Latter-day Saint religion, the Mormons, and they were small town folk. They lived very ordinary lives. They farmed, they ranched, they ran local stores.
Kanab would have been just a little farming community, people trying to scratch a life out of the dirt.
They didn't want much to do with anything with him or his treasure at that time.
Freddie simply couldn't understand how they could turn their backs on one of the world's largest hauls of riches. When the Spanish first saw the treasure, they were awestruck by the vast array of jade, turquoise, silver, and gold. But when the conquistadors ransacked the Aztec capital, they discovered that the treasure had vanished. When faced with an agonizing death, the Aztecs still refused to reveal where the treasure had been hidden. Freddie Crystal was convinced that the priceless hoard had been spirited away to southern Utah. His belief was absolute. The story of Aztec gold had come to him in a vision.
Before Freddie ever even got to Kanab, he was a prospector up in Idaho. He was working in a mine and he got hit in the head with a crowbar, which caused him to have what he called a panorama, which for most intents and purposes we would call a vision.
In the vision, Freddie said he had seen a large number of Aztec warriors leading a massive procession of slaves. This large group headed north and crossed the Rio Grande into what is now Texas. They then traveled across New Mexico into Arizona and finally reached the Colorado River. The Aztecs and the long line of slaves moved into what is now southern Utah. But then suddenly Freddie Crystal's vision started to fade. The Aztecs and the slaves completely disappeared. Then one image slowly emerged from the haziness. It was a type of ancient rock carving known as a petroglyph. Freddie was completely baffled. Why had he seen the warriors driving a slave train thousands of miles north from the Aztec lands to what is now southern Utah? Freddie decided to find out all he could about the history of the long-lost Aztec nation. His reading led him to the events surrounding the downfall of the once mighty Aztec Empire. Although the Aztecs were renowned for ruthless cruelty and mass blood sacrifice, they initially welcomed the Spanish conquistador, Hernán Cortés. Cortés couldn't have timed his arrival better. It had been prophesied a white god would appear in 1519, and here he was, standing before them. The Spaniard wanted to see gold, and the obliging Aztecs showed their new god straight to their treasury. The conquistadors were staggered, and one of their number stated that all the riches of the world were to be found in that single room. When the inevitable hostilities broke out, the Spanish murdered Montezuma and made straight for his treasure room. But the vaults were empty. The treasure was gone. But the Spaniards hadn't traveled this far to simply give up on the biggest cache of booty they'd ever laid their eyes on. And when it came to cruelty, the conquistadors could teach the Aztecs a trick or two. They wanted that treasure and were prepared to do whatever it took to find out where it was. It was said that not a single Aztec cracked. Freddie then read later accounts, stating that the treasure had been spirited away to the north, to the fabled original homeland of the Aztecs, Aztlan, located in what is now the southwest of the USA. Legend has it that the Aztec warriors were sealed up with the treasure in a cave. Their mission, to protect their emperor's treasure from anyone who broke in to steal it. And now, at last, Freddie realized the meaning of his vision. He was convinced he'd seen the army of slaves carrying the treasure trove as far north as the Colorado River. At that point, the vision had blurred. But then one tantalizing clue was revealed, and Freddie believed this was the marker pointing to the location of Montezuma's treasure.
He did have one clue, and the clue he had was a petroglyph that had been carved onto a red wall.
But the southwestern states of America are full of red canyons, covered with thousands of petroglyphs. For Freddie to find one particular petroglyph somewhere out in the vast wilderness seemed an impossible task. Freddie Crystal had hit a brick wall. Months later, Freddie had pretty much given up on ever finding the treasure. Then one evening, after a hard day's prospecting, Freddie decided to catch up on the local news. His eye was drawn to one article. It was all about a Mormon elder, a Mr. Levi E. Young.
And he had gone down to Kanab to conduct some church business, and then had, for fun, taken some pictures and done just some sightseeing of the gorgeous country down there.
But it was the photograph that really made Freddie sit up. There was no doubt about it. It was the very same image he had seen in his panoramic vision. And Levi Young had now told him where it was. It was somewhere on a canyon wall, somewhere near a town called Kanab. Freddie jumped on his bike and headed 300 miles to the south. He was convinced he was finally honing in on the long-lost treasure. But Freddie's blind faith in his cause wasn't shared by the devout Mormons down in Kanab.
Most of the people in Kanab did not give him the time of day, but one gentleman was willing to take a chance on Freddie, and his name was Oscar Robinson. He owned a ranch, and he agreed to let Freddie come stay at his ranch.
Oscar Robinson took Freddie in and gave him free board and lodging.
This was a cowboy ranch. Oscar Robinson had a bunch of livestock, some sheep and some cows, and so he helped subsidize and give Freddie a stake.
A lot of the other ranchers didn't like Freddie. He was a bit of a freeloader, and his one purpose to be in Kanab was to find the gold.
Freddie had landed on his feet. The Robinson Ranch was right in the heart of the canyons surrounding Kanab. It was prime petroglyph hunting territory. Every morning, Freddie would set out early from the ranch. He needed to check every single yard of the vast canyons and cliffs radiating out for miles, all around Kanab.
Kanab is a town that is surrounded by beautiful red cliffs. It's rugged country. It's huge. I mean, we're almost next to the Grand Canyon.
Many of the canyon walls are covered with petroglyphs. Freddie had to check out every single one.
And so for one person to try and pinpoint the exact location was an overwhelming task.
But not for Freddie. He was a man on a mission dictated by a vision.
He searched the hills for about 2 years, all the while the ranchers at Oscar Robinson's ranch making fun of him nightly, telling him he was crazy.
Freddie would also show the photograph to anyone who would still give him the time of day. And then, in 1916, he finally got some fantastic news. One man had seen the petroglyph that Freddie thought would point him to the location of the treasure. Crystal couldn't believe how he could have overlooked it. It was just 2 miles up the road from the Robinson Ranch. And then he found out how.
Some told him that the petroglyph had been blasted off the wall.
It seems a farmer had wanted to create a shelter under the rock to store hay. And he had unwittingly reduced Freddie's vital marker to Montezuma's treasure to a sad heap of sand in an instant. Freddie Crystal seemed to have taken the news badly and vanished just as suddenly as he had appeared. And the people of Kanab assumed it was the last they would ever see of the wild-eyed man and his tall tales of lost treasure. Then, in early 1922, a familiar figure was seen cycling along Johnson Canyon.
They were very surprised 6 years later when Freddie showed up back in town.
Freddie made a beeline for the Robinson Ranch. He had some great news for his old partner, Oscar.
And he said he had spent the last 6 years in Mexico finding a map.
After the sudden destruction of the petroglyph, a desperate Freddie had recalled his fevered vision. He had seen the vast procession of slaves leave what he now knew was the capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. In their rage at not finding the treasure, the Spanish razed the ancient Aztec city to the ground and rebuilt it as Mexico City. Freddie traveled to the city and once there, heard an intriguing rumor. It was said that one Aztec had been caught by the Spanish and he had a map. Furthermore, the map revealed the location of Montezuma's treasure. In the mayhem during the bloody Spanish conquest, the precious map had been lost. Freddie learned that the old colonial records were stored in the basement of a monastery. So in the dead of night, Freddie Crystal jumped the wall and broke in. And finally, he found exactly what he was looking for.
The map described an area. It had a cliff. Below the cliff, there was supposed to be a marsh, and then it was surrounded by 7 mountains.
The cliffs and marshes reminded Freddie of the landscape in Johnson Canyon, but included something he had never seen on his many trips through the hills. A set of steps leading upwards. Freddie was convinced the treasure had to be hidden at the top, behind the entrance.
When Freddie returned, it was almost like a rewind. Once again, he started searching the hills. He would hike to the top of mountains with his map in hand.
Freddie was looking for a spot where he could see 7 mountains lined up, as on the map.
Once he got to the top of different cliffs and mountains, he would pull out his map and he would try to match the different geographical landmarks.
And now he had a map. Some of the younger cowboys started to show more interest in Freddie's story. Alvin Judd, Oscar Robinson's 16-year-old son-in-law, was particularly keen. In his spare time, Alvin and his pal Cowhide Adams would join Freddie on his search. Freddie told them when they found the steps, they would lead to a cave sealed up with a layer of mortar. Behind this wall would be an army of ghostly Aztec warriors standing guard over the treasure. But most of the time, Freddie was out on his own, scouring the canyons to try and find the spot where the 7 mountains all lined up. And then on Thanksgiving in 1922, Freddie scanned the horizon and suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He pulled out his map and...
That was the day that he found the perfect match, picture perfect. Everything was there, the 7 mountains, the cliff, the marsh beneath, it all fit.
Footsore Freddie couldn't believe his luck. He had finally done it. He rounded up the young cowboys, Alvin Judd and Cowhide Adams, and they raced off to what they hoped was the cliff containing the treasure cave. Crystal scanned the canyon. He was looking for a set of steps cut into the rock face.
They found the cliff, they were at the bottom, and they saw that there were stone steps going up.
Freddie scrambled ahead, leaving the youngsters for dust.
And all the excitement and all the blood pressure went up, and here's going to be the gold.
Freddie was looking for something out of the ordinary in the rock face, some feature that didn't quite fit in.
When they got up to the mountain where the steps were, they were looking around trying to find an opening, which there wasn't, but there was a little indention.
It was though Crystal had a sixth sense. Somehow he just knew there was something special about this spot.
He actually pulled out a pocket knife right then and there.
Immediately they started digging with their pocket knives, with their hands, anything that they could open up that face with.
And beneath the soft sandy face, there was something harder.
It was like mortar in between rocks.
The mortar was made from limestone, a mineral not found in Johnson Canyon.
The closest is found 20 miles from here. So obviously, somebody had brought that here to close up that wall, and it had to be the Aztecs.
Freddie believed he was now just feet away from the riches that had been snatched away from Cortez and his conquistadors.
Any moment Freddie knew he was going to break through that wall and find a mass cavern of riches that the Aztecs had stored there.
And then suddenly, they were through.
And they figured, oh my goodness, here it is.
Freddie told the youngsters to hold back while he went in to scout out the cave. He knew the cave was reputed to be guarded by a long-dead army of Aztec warriors. Freddie edged nervously along the sandy cavern. And then...
There was actually a booby trap, and a boulder had rolled onto one of his legs and had actually pinned him there.
Was this the curse of Montezuma? Freddie desperately shouted for help, and Alvin Judd rushed to his aid.
If he had been alone, it could have been fatal. He could have died there in the caves.
There was no sign of Aztec warriors. But now they were worried. There could be more dangerous booby traps lying just up ahead.
The excitement withdrew.
The brush with death quickly sobered the mood amongst the trio of treasure hunters.
It was dangerous. It was more than they could handle.
And that's when they went to town and says, we've got to get the word out. We've got to get more people up here.
Freddie rushed back to Kanab. He was anxious to tell everyone he was on the verge of finding Montezuma's treasure. But he needed help, and lots of it.
And once word had got out that he had found the treasure cave, the whole town loved Freddie. It wasn't Freddie the freak or Freddie the weirdo anymore.
Finally convinced that Freddie may be onto something, the whole community decided to help dig out the treasure, and then they would all share out the spoils.
If you go back to the design of the community and how the western part of this country worked was community-based. So it worked the same way with this adventure on finding Montezuma's treasure. Everybody worked together.
Within days, Kanab effectively shut up shop. The townsfolk jumped in their buggies and rode to Johnson Canyon to dig out the treasure.
For a town like Kanab to completely shut down, it's really quite remarkable.
All of a sudden, a little community blossomed up down the bottom of the canyon, and they began to dig.
They had jobs, just like as if they were in town. Some people were in charge of the water. They had people that were in charge of the cooking, the cleaning, the digging.
In the 1920s, what they used to dig with was shovels, picks, rakes, buckets, anything that they could find. Everything had to be done by hand. They'd have a bunch of buckets and a line brigade. So one would take a bucket, hand it to the next, like you're putting out a fire.
Everybody had a part, and it ran like oiled clockwork because everybody wanted that treasure.
These are ranchers, farmers, and working is their living. And so they kind of put their lives on hold for Freddie Crystal.
In the 1920s, Kanab was one of the most isolated communities in the USA. But they knew completely closing down the town could attract unwanted attention.
It was like a tent city here in Johnson Canyon, and certain people were left in town to make it look like the town was still busy and that it was thriving.
The people of Kanab were used to thinking independently. In 1912, they had appointed the world's first all-woman council.
The all-woman town council levied a fine on anyone who spoke the word treasure out loud. They wanted to take all precautions to make sure that no outsiders would hear of the treasure and try to come and claim some of the gold for themselves.
The Women Council, they put a lid on it, and that information didn't get out very far at the time.
But despite the Petticoat Council's best efforts, pretty soon rumors began to spread. Strange things were afoot down in Kane County.
There's a story of two gentlemen from Salt Lake City who managed to hear something that was going on down in Kanab, got excited about it, rode down. When they got to Kanab, everything was closed. The businesses, no one was home.
Apparently, a stable lad let the cat out of the bag and pointed the strangers towards Johnson's Canyon.
When they got there, they didn't get very close to where the people were working and before someone pulled a gun on them and said, "You need to leave." And they did.
Untroubled by intruders, the big dig continued apace. When they got to the end of the first cave, they broke through a wall, but found yet another series of caverns stretching back into the mountain. There was no sign of gold, just tons of dirt.
People were starting to doubt that there was actually even any treasure to be found.
That next shovelful, because that's what kept everybody going. It's just going to be the next shovelful. But when is that next shovelful stop?
One by one, people were beginning to lose faith in Freddie Crystal.
Slowly, people started to give up the search and would, gradually head back to their farms and their families and their way of life again.
But a hard core of diggers carried on, driven on by thoughts of treasure.
I'm sure that there was a lot of people felt, you know, just one more shovelful.
And after 2 long years, the remaining gold diggers were finally on the verge of breaking through to the last cavern.
Everybody was seeing gold in their eyes. Any moment, the next shovelful, they're going to get it.
They finally broke through the cave wall, but were faced with a heartbreaking sight.
Somebody told me they found an old Spaniard helmet. I think a half of a moccasin they found back in there. There wasn't much for as much time as they spent. There wasn't any gold. They certainly didn't find any gold. I can't imagine what their hearts might have felt.
But Freddie Crystal had spent well over 10 years looking for the treasure, and he wasn't about to quit now.
Freddie himself was discouraged, so he took another look at the map. And it hit him that the tunnels were probably just a temporary holding of the treasure, and that the place they really needed to look was underneath all of the material they had just removed from the cave.
So Freddie said, you know what? We have got to dig here where we have been throwing all this stuff for 2 years.
Freddie's sudden change of plan went down like a lead balloon.
The townspeople were not happy with this. They had just spent, I don't know, quite a long time emptying the tunnels to then be told they needed to move the very same material once again. And they lost interest.
In 1924, the empty-handed townsfolk finally abandoned the dig and turned their backs on the man who had filled their heads full of treasure.
Freddie just disappeared one day, and nobody really knew what happened to Freddie. Some speculated that the townspeople got angry at him and someone murdered him.
It was said he was murdered in fury for all the wasted time. Some thought he was killed for his map, but others believed he had incurred the wrath of Montezuma and thought he may not be the last to die searching for the treasure. But Alvin Judd kept his faith in Freddie and his tales of Aztec gold, and when he had any spare time,
He was up there digging, my grandfather, and with his brothers. He spent 30 years or more up there.
Alvin found no trace of the legendary gold. But it wasn't to be the last the Judd family were to hear about Montezuma and missing Aztec treasure. Freddie Crystal had arrived at Oscar Robinson's ranch in 1914. Almost 70 years later, another stranger showed up, talking about Montezuma and his long-lost treasure. His name was Raymond Dillman.
The Dillmans showed up, and my mother was there alone this particular day.
And this old green van drove up. And it was full of these Spanish-looking people, and they were big people.
My mother was kind of scared because it was, you know, she's out there alone.
And they didn't dare get out of the van. My mom tells this story lots better than I do.
When I saw the occupants in there, it really quite frightened me for a minute, you know, and I thought, oh no, what would I do? You know, well, the dogs took care of it.
And those old dogs probably would have licked you to death. Other than that, they would have done a thing to you, but they had a big bark.
Orrinell Judd eventually summoned up all her courage.
I went over there and he asked me if there were any hieroglyphics on the walls.
And she says, yeah, there's some right there by the house.
And he said, well, can I see them? He said, sure. So she walked over there and showed him.
Raymond Dillman was looking for petroglyphs of 3 animals all in a line. Below them, 3 circles.
And it was the exact pictures that he was looking for.
But there was one final image Dillman needed to account for.
Well, do you have this big bullseye? Yeah, there's one down the canyon.
The bullseye petroglyph, a 9-spiraled circle, confirmed Ray Dillman's theory.
And he says, the Montezuma treasure is buried on your property. I said, said, oh, really?
Is that what turned your hair white?
Yes, all of a sudden.
Any other family would probably have politely asked Ray Dillman to leave, but not the Judds.
It's unusual, and it pricked our interests because naturally it was in our family, or we'd been part of Freddie Crystal and the whole 9 yards, and then to have somebody else come out of the blue and come right to there, and then for us to be able to take him right to the picture because we knew they were there.
It's been in my family a long time. And this Dillman story of coming to our doorstep and continuing the saga in the 70s, early 80s, was amazing to us.
Raymond Dillman told the Judds he had spent the previous 16 years studying a curious set of tablets called the Peralta Stones. The stones were found in the 1950s, buried by a highway in Arizona. The Peralta Stones are thought by some to be a map to the legendary Dutchman's Mine in Arizona. But Ray Dillman believed the stones had led him directly to the petroglyphs on the Judd Ranch, what he claimed was the site of Montezuma's treasure.
The picture of the horse's head and so forth is what was on the ranch. The rest of the tablets actually had the map, the etchings of the map to how that's how they got there. That's how they got to Johnson Canyon.
Dillman claimed both Aztec and Native American ancestry, and this had enabled him to decipher the symbols on the stones. And if the stone map was good enough for Ray Dillman, it was sure good enough for Bruce and Brent Judd. The brothers got themselves an excavator and headed down the canyon, aiming straight for the bullseye.
And we started digging this place out.
In the 1920s, the whole town of Kanab had turned out with buckets and spades. 60 years later, it was just 2 men, but they had their heavyweight excavator.
The amount of dirt that we moved was 30 or 40 or 50 times more than what they did. When you think that they didn't have any equipment, everything was handmade.
After a few days of digging, there was a huge pile of dirt and rock at the base of the cliff. The ground under the 9-spiral bullseye was now exposed, and they soon made a grisly find. Bones. Lots of bones.
Half their bodies had been burned. We're going, oh my gosh, he told us that they were going to be here.
But it wasn't just bones. They hit a ledge, and suddenly a small object tumbled down towards them.
And it came running down towards us, and we all backed up and thought, oh my heck, this is a skull coming after us. And come to find out, it was just a pot, had clay on the top of it, and inside was 213 turquoise beads.
It wasn't yet Montezuma's treasure, but it seemed a very good sign of the riches to come.
So you can imagine how our hearts were pumping. You can imagine the gold in our eyes.
Just above the site was a strange-looking rock that further encouraged the brothers that they were on the right track.
We call it the sacrificial stone. It was big enough that a man 6 or 7 foot tall could be laid out on this stone, and it had a drain line where it would actually drain off the face of the cliff down off this face.
The find had the brothers reaching for their history books. They quickly learned all about the Aztecs' fondness for blood sacrifice. So had they found the execution site of the slaves who had carried the treasure from the Aztec capital in the early 1500s?
My thought was, dang, this is a place where they sacrificed, because the blood could naturally go off the edge of the cliff.
We figured it was that they were probably the Aztecs and that they'd beaten the people.
And when they excavated further, under the cliff, they found a set of flat stones.
We'd take that cover stone off, and the hole was completely full of sand. We'd go in and dig out that hole, go down about 8 feet, and then we thought we had a tunnel. Here's the entrance to the cave. Montezuma's is just the next shovelful. 2 feet in diameter, just enough for one person to get down in there. And guess what we found? Bodies.
There were stones placed over the openings. And the first one that we opened up was just chock-a-block full of bones, human bones. The bones had been cannibalized, they'd been eaten.
The Judd brothers had clearly uncovered a burial ground. But could the bones be the remains of Aztec slaves that had carried the treasure far from the south? The answer turned out to be no. Carbon dating revealed the skeletons were from around 2000 BC, predating the fall of Montezuma by 3,500 years. These were not the bones of the Aztec slaves. It was a body blow for Brent and Bruce, and they called a halt to their hunt. However, the brothers remain convinced that Montezuma's treasure exists, and it is out here in the wild country surrounding Kanab.
It's here. It's definitely here.
It's here. I believe that Montezuma's treasure is here someplace.
And Bruce now claims he knows where some of the treasure is actually hidden.
I can probably say that I know where part of it is, but I'm not, I'll never go to it. I'll never go after it.
Bruce now believes it is far too dangerous to hunt the treasure.
Yeah, there's people who've lost their lives. The one took his boy back to see it, and a rattlesnake actually killed his son. And so there's some wild stories back in there. They've actually had some of the old Indians come back and say, "It's not time, leave it alone."
The fact that the treasure may be cursed was whispered around Kanab, but it didn't deter everyone in town. Brant Child was a good friend of the Judds, but he was convinced the treasure wasn't at their ranch. He thought it was hidden under this lake, just north of Kanab. He too believed the Aztecs finally halted here after fleeing the Spanish, and that this was part of their legendary homeland, Aztlan.
These Aztecs decided they had to leave and take their treasure elsewhere. So they came back to their homeland, back to this country. And they knew they had to put it someplace where Cortez wouldn't get it.
Brant Child said that when the Aztecs arrived here, the lake didn't exist. The slaves had dug a tunnel into the cliff, walled up the treasure, then flooded the valley. His son Lon explains.
There was probably around 4,000 to 6,000 warriors. The theory is that they actually killed the warriors that brought the gold here. And the Aztecs believed in the afterlife. And so their assignment was to protect this area.
But thousands of dead Aztec warriors were not going to deter a man like Brant Child.
When he wanted to go after something, he really went after it.
Brant brought in dive teams to explore the underwater cave. But the divers quickly swam into trouble.
We had a professional group of divers out of San Francisco that came down. They came down with $100,000 worth of equipment. What happened with them is their equipment kept breaking down. And they just had all kinds of trouble.
Linda lost her air. And when we got back out, Linda's air tank had been turned completely off. Nothing wrong with the tank itself. She had plenty of air in the tank, but it had just been turned off.
The divers could offer no rational explanation for the constant equipment malfunctions. But they all agreed that there was something strange happening in the underwater cavern.
They were seeing all kinds of ghostly figures, a lot of crazy things.
He says, I'm being choked, I'm being choked. I can see ghostly figures all around me and they're choking me. I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Get me out, get me out.
Tony Thurber had been a professional diver for over 20 years.
I've been diving all over the world, and I've never had a terrifying experience as scary as this one was.
And it wasn't just the diver who had a close brush with death that day.
We woke up late that night and the room was full of propane gas. And propane is very deadly. And so we had to leave the room, and I have no idea why it leaked. It had never leaked before and never leaked after.
Although strange, inexplicable things were happening in the cave, there was no shortage of fresh divers ready to take up the challenge.
There was many different divers that came down and had pretty much the same experience almost every time.
Every single dive ended in failure. Brant Child now decided on a radical solution.
The easiest way would have been to access the treasure would have been just to drain the lake. And what Dad wanted to do to drain it, actually, is just dig a big trench and drain it out into a field.
But there was a problem.
The federal government got wind of that, and they went to Dad and they threatened him. They said, "You don't touch that lake."
The US Fish and Wildlife Department informed Brand his lake was home to a critically endangered subspecies, the Kanab amber snail. Killing just one snail would leave Brand picking up a bill for $50,000. Lon believes it's no coincidence that the rare snails live in the lake. He believes they were put there to guard the treasure.
The Aztecs used a golden snail in their religious rituals. So the theory is that the Aztecs brought their golden snail from Mexico and planted it where they planted the gold. The amber snail is a means of protecting access to the treasure.
With the amber snails successfully blocking the lake route, Brant now hatched a new plan. He brought in a crew to drill down into the cave. But then one of the crew had an unusual experience.
He said, "It's the strangest thing because I looked over on this knoll and there was an Indian standing there in full Indian garb and he was holding a spear." And I said, "Oh, come on." And he said, "Well, I started going about my business again, and then I looked back to see if he was still there and he was gone."
If this was a warning, the drillers chose to ignore it. And it wasn't long before they broke through to a cavern. And when they brought the drill bit up, they were staggered.
When they pulled the drill bit out, it was flakes of gold on the drill bit tip.
It was an amazing development, and they needed to see just what was down in the cave.
They decided that they'd put a little camera down there, and the story is that when they got the camera in the cavern, they could see a statue and a pile of something.
He said he could see something in the middle of the room that was piled up in the middle of the room, and then he said he seen an image over to the side of the door where he figured the door was at, that there was somebody standing there.
Some say it wasn't a statue, it was a figure of a man. And then this pile that they couldn't make out because they didn't have enough lighting. Yeah, they were very excited.
But the excitement of the find was to be overshadowed by tragedy.
And that well driller went home that night and he had a heart attack and died. And then what I understand is a few weeks later, his wife died too.
His own brother won't come to this very day and get the drilling rig that's still parked right up there up on top.
And then, Brant got a visit from a mysterious Native American.
Dad said, "Well, that was the strangest thing. This Indian just came out and he told me that the treasure was here, but it is to be used for the Indians, to unite the Indian tribes, and that bad things would happen to you if you continue to go after it, so you need to quit trying to go after it."
And this wasn't the end of the strange incident.
They both started walking back, following his tracks in the sand, and after a while, his tracks just disappeared. My dad got to the point where he truly believed that it was probably just protected and it wasn't meant to come out, and so he gave up trying.
We can't disturb it. It's designed, it's hid up, and it's protected by these warriors that were left here.
Brant finally decided to give up his pursuit of Montezuma's treasure. In September 2002, he died in a traffic accident. Some consider the circumstances surrounding his death as somewhat mysterious.
Brant Childs was killed in Marysville Canyon when he hit a horse in the canyon. A lot of people think it could have been because he disturbed the treasure. Some people believe it's cursed.
It's been cursed with a curse to protect it.
Some now believe that the treasure belongs to the descendants of the Aztecs, the Native American people.
The legend says that there's a chosen one and that he will be able to come and access the treasure, and then it will be used for the Indians.
Like I say, when the time's right, then it'll come out.
Lon Child has brought a halt to any attempts to get hold of the treasure at the lake.
We're gonna let the Aztecs sleep. Yeah, they can have their treasure.
Today, many in Kanab are convinced that the 6,000 Aztec warriors continue their silent vigil. They believe the warriors await anyone reckless enough to disturb the treasure of their long-dead emperor, the mighty Montezuma. History tells that in the 16th century, the great Inca Empire fled from the ferocious onslaught of Spanish conquistadors. Somewhere deep inside the jungles of Peru, the Incas built a last stronghold. There, they made their final stand against their ruthless enemy. But with their death, the memory of where this last refuge was disappeared. But one man was determined to find it. An American explorer named Hiram Bingham.
He was Indiana Jones. He was 6'4", he looked like a Hollywood idol. He was a man obsessed with this mission.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
And he did find an extraordinary Inca city. Machu Picchu. It was hailed as the lost city in the clouds, a spiritual Inca refuge perching high on top of a skyscraping mountain. Bingham was convinced he had found the long-lost city of the Incas, their final refuge from the Spanish conquest. But all was not as it seemed. In 1911, there was a young scholar specializing in modern Latin American history at Yale University, USA, Hiram Bingham. But he was no impoverished academic. Bingham was 36 years old, married to Alfreda Mitchell, an heiress to the Tiffany Diamond Empire. They had 6 young sons and lived in a 30-roomed mansion on top of a hill. He was a man who seemed to have all the comforts of life. But Bingham was restless and driven.
Hiram Bingham had a really compulsive need to become famous, and I think that's because of his family.
He was Hiram Bingham III, and I think that's incredibly important because his grandfather, Hiram Bingham I, he was a very powerful, impressive missionary character, and so was his father, Hiram Bingham II. So there's this legacy, this weight on his shoulders that he had to prove himself or do something with his life at the very least.
What that something could be he had absolutely no idea. To secure a permanent position at Yale University, Bingham went to Peru in 1909 to study the Spanish trade routes between Buenos Aires and Lima. During the journey, he was invited by his guide to see an ancient Inca site high up in the Andes Mountains. It was an event that would change his life.
It was my first introduction to prehistoric American history. I agreed, not knowing that it was going to lead me into a fascinating field.
Bingham is taken to this remote Inca ruin called Choqquequirao, which means cradle of gold, and is immediately struck by the romance of the position.
The Inca ruins lay 10,000 feet above sea level, and the climb was astounding, with breathtaking views of the distant snow-capped mountains and the roar of the Apurimac River below. It was also exhilarating.
At times, the trail was so steep that it was easier to go on all fours than to attempt to walk erect. Most of the time, we were hanging on to the side of the mountain almost by our eyelids.
On the way up, they saw amazing sights, including a huge condor that sailed down to take a look at them.
We could not only see his cruel beak and great talons, but even the whites of his eyes. It was an awe-inspiring moment.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
Eventually, they reached the Inca ruins on the flattened peak. For Bingham, it was a magical experience. Choqquequirao was built in the 15th century and was believed to be a sacred Inca dwelling and one of their frontier fortresses. It was designed to defend the approaches to their great capital city, Cusco. Bingham wrote to his wife Alfreda to tell her it was the most interesting place he had ever seen.
He's amazingly impressed by the remains of Inca architecture because he'd never known about this before. He'd heard of the Incas, but he didn't know that what they'd achieved was quite as impressive as this. And people see this as a sort of epiphany, you know, this really changes the direction of his life.
Till now, Bingham's knowledge of South American history was limited to the Spanish colonial days, and he knew very little about the Incas. As he looked out to the distant mountains, Bingham was keen to find out more about them. Who were these people who built this extraordinary place? What was their story?
Those snow-capped peaks in an unknown and unexplored part of Peru fascinated me greatly. They tempted me to go see what lay beyond.
And he thought of this line from Kipling.
Something hidden. Go and find it. Go and look behind the ranges.
You get this feeling that this worked on him, on his imagination, that somewhere just beyond the range was a city, a world, a reputation to be found.
Back in the Yale Library, Bingham began researching the Inca history he opened the pages of the Spanish Chronicles, a key source on Spain's golden age of discovery, conquest, and colonization of the Americas.
He began reading more about the Incas. And of course, even as a non-academic, the story of the conquistadors and the Incas is incredibly exciting.
Bingham learned how from the early 13th century to the middle to late 16th century, the Incas were the most powerful empire in the Americas. Their domain stretched over 2,000 miles, from modern-day Chile to the Amazon. But then came catastrophe. In 1532, the Spanish conquistadors, headed by their ruthless leader, Francisco Pizarro, entered the Inca heartland. He was hell-bent on their destruction. Over the next 40 years, the Spaniards drove the Indians from their cities and slaughtered them in their thousands.
Bingham really is intrigued by the history of the last Incas and what they'd done after the Spaniards arrived.
Bingham's eyes were drawn to an account where a young Inca emperor named Manco had led his people as they fled their capital city, Cusco, in 1536. Manco managed to escape the Spanish and created a new Inca capital called Vitcos, 10,000 feet above sea level, somewhere in the remote mountainous region of the Vilcabamba Valley. But the Spanish conquistadors were in hot pursuit, and the Incas fled again. This time, the chronicles said, they went down from their mountain homes into the Amazon lowland. There, protected by a dense jungle in the largest rainforest in the world, they built a new city called Vilcabamba. And it was here that the Incas made their last stand. But it was all to no avail. In 1572, the Spaniards finally defeated the Incas. And so with their death, their last refuge, Vilcabamba, disappeared from history. Bingham was transfixed by the story of Vilcabamba. But for all the references of the city, there was one vital clue missing.
Nobody, as far as he could see, knew where it was. This appealed to Bingham as a puzzle he could solve himself.
Bingham tried to work out where Vilcabamba could be. The Spanish chronicles said it lay 30 miles and 2 long days' journey from Vitcos. But he had no idea even where Vitcos was. Continuing his studies, he found another clue. The chronicles said that Vitcos was 100 miles northwest of Cusco, along the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range. Bingham knew where Cusco was. He had visited it on his last trip to South America. But if no one knew where Vitcos was, how would he know when he'd reached it? There was a further clue in the Spanish accounts. They said that there was a sacred area with a large white rock close by the city. So if Bingham could locate the white rock, he would know he had found Vitcos. Now Bingham realized that if he could find Vitcos, then 2 days beyond it, he should be able to find Vilcabamba. This, Bingham thought, would be how he could make his name. He would lead an expedition to find the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba. Bingham began to form his team.
He needed to be funded to take an expedition down there, particularly then. It was an expensive business.
The first thing Bingham did was approach a number of corporations. Businesses specializing in America's outdoor country pursuits offered their support. Abercrombie & Fitch supplied Bingham with an explorer's outfit.
He managed to get Winchester to give him a rifle, Kodak to give a camera, and then he turned to his classmates.
Bingham estimated that he would need 6 expedition members, and that each one would require $1,800 to cover their travel and food expenses. One former classmate heard about his plans and offered him $1,800 if he would take a Yale geologist with him. Bingham snapped up the offer. Others came forward. One was a topographer, another a mountain climbing engineer. Eventually, Bingham got together a multidisciplinary team.
So he's got a doctor, a naturalist, geologist, a couple of topographers. So it's a pretty good, well-rounded, versatile team.
To pay his own way, Bingham promised to write 4 articles for the fashionable Harper's magazine, but he was still $1,800 short. Only now did he turn to the one source he could rely on, his wife Alfreda, to tap the Tiffany fortune. She agreed. Bingham's party left New York for Peru on the 8th of June, 1911. Their destination, the former Inca capital city, Cusco. This, Bingham knew, lay near the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range and would be his starting off point. Bingham's expedition arrived in Cusco on the 2nd of July, 1911. His aim was to first locate the sacred white rock at Vitcos, then to make his way down from the mountains into the lowland Amazon jungle to search for Vilcabamba. Bingham and his best friend, a naturalist named Harry Foote, set out on the morning of the 19th of July, 1911, on their quest for where they believed Vilcabamba could be. The rest of the party were dispatched to carry out geological and mapping surveys of the Andes.
So they head off across the high-altitude lands, then descend into the Urubamba Valley itself. And the Urubamba is the famous sacred valley of the Incas, and follow the river along, sort of heading generally in the direction northwest.
Bingham kept a meticulous diary of his expedition. Today, it is regarded as one of the greatest first-hand accounts in the history of exploration.
I had entered the marvelous canyon of the Urubamba. Here the river runs through gigantic mountains of granite. I know of nowhere in the world that can compare with it.
Bingham writes in the most compulsive way. He's someone with academic authority, and yet he knows how to tell a good story.
Not only does it have great snow peaks looming above the clouds more than 2 miles overhead, it also has, in striking contrast, orchids and tree ferns, and the mysterious witchery of the jungle.
He paints pictures with words, and not just of visual things, but of the heart, you know, the spirit, what you're feeling.
One is drawn irresistibly onward by ever-recurring surprises, through a deep and winding gorge, turning and twisting past overhanging cliffs of incredible height.
He's still got a little way to go before he gets to this area where he thinks he's going to find Vikos, the old Inca capital. So he's sort of working himself in, working the team in.
On the evening of the 23rd of July 1911, after a 70-mile journey from Cusco and 3/4 of the way to where Vikos is said to be, Bingham and Foote set up camp for the night in a canyon surrounded by steep mountains.
They camp at a place called Mandor Pampa, and they meet a man there called Melchor Arteaga. And he questions him, he says, you know, are there ruins around here?
Arteaga told Bingham there were some fine ones on top of the opposite mountain called Huayna Picchu, and also on a ridge called Machu Picchu, or Old Peak.
People in Peru were always telling him that if he gave them a bit of money, they could lead him to a ruin. And there was a little bit of sort of won't get fooled again feeling in his team.
They had heard ruins were around many times, and they'd gone, it would be one little house or a couple of things.
And this is where I think we have to give a lot of credit to Bingham, because lesser men would have said, oh, for God's sake, you know, there's not supposed to be anything up that hill. There's nothing in the history books. This is just a wild goose chase.
Bingham noted the ruins' names in his pocket diary and arranged for Arteaga to take him there the following day. The morning of the 24th of July, 1911, dawned with a cold rain. Bingham prepared for his climb up Machu Picchu. His best friend, Harry Foote, didn't fancy the wet conditions.
The naturalist said there were more butterflies near the river. Anyway, it was my job to investigate. Arteaga shivered. He said it was too hard to climb for such a wet day. But when he found out that I was willing to pay him 3 or 4 times the ordinary daily wage, he finally agreed to go.
Arteaga and Bingham left the camp at 10 a.m.
After a walk of about 3/4 of an hour, Arteaga left the main road and plunged down through the bank of the river. Here there was a primitive bridge which crossed the roaring rapids. It was obvious that no one could live for an instant in the icy cold rapids, but would immediately be dashed to pieces against the rocks.
He said, I admit freely, I was on my hands and knees going really, really slowly across, and all I could think of was, I hope the water doesn't go up because it'll just take the bridge away.
After the river came the mountain.
Leaving the stream, we now struggled up the bank through dense jungle. And in a few minutes, reached the bottom of a very precipitous slope. For an hour and 20 minutes, we had a hard climb. A good part of the distance, we went on all fours, sometimes holding on by our fingernails.
Bingham was now climbing at nearly 8,000 feet.
Bingham was going up through very difficult cloud forest. Conditions were humid, it was hard work.
Shortly after noon, just as we were completely exhausted, we reached several good-natured Indians who were pleasantly surprised by our unexpected arrival. It seemed that these Indians had chosen this eagle's nest for their home.
A small boy named Pablo Richate was sent on to guide Bingham around the ruins.
Led by this little boy around a corner, and he sees something quite extraordinary.
Hardly had we left and rounded the promontory, then we were confronted with an unexpected sight. A great flight of beautifully constructed stone-faced terraces, perhaps 100 of them, each hundreds of feet long and 10 feet high. They had recently been rescued from the jungle by the Indians.
It is an amazingly evocative description of firstly going through what were lovely Inca terraces, Bingham says, and then slowly things build.
From the cleared stonework, he was introduced to another spectacular sight.
Suddenly, without warning, under a huge overhanging ledge, the boy showed me a cave beautifully lined with the finest cut stone.
And then he's going from one wonder to another.
It had evidently been a royal mausoleum. On top of this particular ledge was a semicircular building whose outer wall, gently sloping and slightly curved, bore a striking resemblance to the famous Temple of the Sun in Cusco. Clearly, it was the work of a master artist.
Then there's the temple with the rounded wall, and then cumulatively, the overall effect.
Bingham was stunned by its magnificence and realized that this wasn't just some little Inca settlement he has come to see.
It seemed like an unbelievable dream. Dimly, I began to realize that this wall and its adjoining semicircular temple over the cave were as fine as the finest stonework in the world. It fairly took my breath away. What could this place be? Why had no one given us any idea of it? Surprise followed surprise in bewildering succession. Suddenly we found ourselves standing in front of the ruins of two of the finest and most interesting structures in ancient America.
There are cyclopean stones, as he calls them. Stones the height of a human, but beautifully worked with very, very fine granite.
On the east side of the plaza was another amazing structure. the ruins of a temple containing 3 great windows looking out over the canyon to the rising sun. Like its neighbor, it is unique among Inca ruins.
Bingham had made an extraordinary discovery. It seemed almost too good to be true.
Would anyone believe what I had found? Fortunately, in this land where accuracy in reporting what one has seen is not a prevailing characteristic of travelers, I had a good camera, and the sun was shining.
I know that he had a very special Kodak camera that was made for traveling in rugged territory, and the negatives are huge. So the resolution, you know, the detail is really fantastic.
But one question puzzled Bingham. Where was he?
Now, Bingham was not really looking for a ruin in this part of the world, so he couldn't make sense of what he'd found.
Machu Picchu laid 70 miles from Cusco, so it couldn't be Vitcos, which was said to be 100 miles from Cusco. And it couldn't be the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba, because that was said to be 30 miles on from Vitcos, down on the jungle plains. So what was this astonishing place? Suddenly, Bingham's eye focused on some charcoaled graffiti on a rock of the 3-windowed temple. Lizarraga, 1902. His blood ran cold.
Bingham was a man who wanted to make a name for himself, and he was pulled up short. He suddenly saw this graffiti. Had some scholar got there first?
Bingham wrote the name Lizarraga 1902 in his diary and prayed it wasn't another explorer.
Maybe he'd been picked to the post. Maybe this wasn't really a discovery at all.
Deeply worried, Bingham made his way back down the mountain. He hardly mentioned the Machu Picchu ruins when he returned to the campsite below. In fact, his best friend, Harry Foote, wrote in his diary, no special things to note. Bingham discreetly asked Arteaga about the Lizarraga 1902 graffiti. Arteaga told Bingham, Augustin Lizarraga is the discoverer of Machu Picchu. He lives at San Miguel Bridge, just downstream of your campsite.
And at that point, Hiram Bingham must have sighed and thought, oh, that is that. And he actually writes it in his diary. Lizarraga is the discoverer. And his heart must have sunk.
Bingham was horrified and set off to find the mysterious Lizarraga. But when he got to San Miguel Bridge, Augustin Lizarraga was not at home. So Bingham spoke to his brother, Angel. Angel told him that the ruins were known in the valley and parts of it were cultivated by farmers. His brother was one of those farmers. Bingham relaxed Lizarraga wasn't a rival academic after all. He was just a local Peruvian peasant. Bingham's discovery of Machu Picchu was secure. The very next day, he set off on another long journey to search for the last refuge of the Incas, Vilcabamba. But first, he had to locate the White Rock at Vitcos. Bingham followed the information detailed in the Spanish chronicles he had read back at Yale. He asked every local they passed if they knew the whereabouts of any ruins in the area, and paid local guides to lead him onwards.
He carries on down the valley into even more uncharted territory. He's put the whole thing of Machu Picchu to one side.
"15 days after encountering the ruins of Machu Picchu, Bingham came across the sacred White Rock, mentioned in the chronicles as being close to the Incas' capital city, Vitcos.
It was late on the afternoon of August 9th, 1911, when I first saw this remarkable shrine. We could now be fairly sure that we had located one of Manco's capitals, Vitcos.
If Bingham had found the ruins of the former Inca city, Vitcos, it meant that he had to be on the right track and close to completing his objective, finding their last refuge, Vilcabamba. The Chronicles said it was a long 2-day journey from Vitcos.
By now, Bingham's blood is up. I mean, he realized that these ruins are toppling over like 9 pins. You know, he's found Machu Picchu, he's found Vitcos, and there's one final place he wants to find, which is a place where the Inca emperor and the exiles escaped to if the Spanish ever came looking for them.
Bingham came down from the mountains into the huge lowland jungles of the Amazon. This was now a very different world to the ethereal mountaintops of Machu Picchu. It was a place that even the local Peruvians feared, like the Spanish conquistadors before them.
One of our informants said the Inca city was called Espiritu Pampa, or the Plain of the Ghosts, to be reached only by a hard trail passable for barefooted savages, but scarcely available for us unless we chose to go on our hands and knees.
Finally, after several days traveling, Bingham found, beneath the thick twines of a rainforest jungle, evidence of some ruins. To his excitement, the locals called it Espiritu Pampa. Even better, they also called it Vilcabamba. Surely, Bingham had found the last refuge of the Incas. But as he set to work, he came across something very puzzling. The few buildings he had found were clearly Inca, but their stonework was rough and inferior. Bingham searched for more extensive ruins, but failed to find anything substantial. Bingham wrote in his diary,
After several days digging, ruins well scattered, long hard job to clear ruins, hardly worthwhile.
The more Bingham dug, the more he became convinced that the site just wasn't special enough to be Vilcabamba. But if this wasn't the place where the Incas had their last refuge, then where was it? Slowly, Bingham started to reconsider the evidence. He went back to the Spanish chronicles. They told him that Vilcabamba was the largest city in the province. Machu Picchu was clearly much bigger than anything he had found in the jungle. Then there was the puzzling issue of the inferior architecture. Nothing he saw in the Amazon matched the finely cut stone at Machu Picchu. Bingham also wondered about something else. Would the Incas, who are highland people, have really made a home down in the flatland jungle?
It does not seem reasonable that such people would have cared to live in the hot valley of Espiritu Pampa. These Inca ruins are unique in lying so low in the Amazon jungle. The difference in climate is as great as that between Scotland and Egypt. Furthermore, they could have found the seclusion and safety which they craved just as well in several other parts of the province, particularly at Machu Picchu.
Now he began focusing on another issue. The chronicles stated that the city of Vilcabamba lay 2 days' march from Vitkos. So did Machu Picchu, albeit in a different direction.
Machu Picchu was roughly 2 days from Vitkos if you walked across, and he did it. He walked from Vitkos across back to Machu Picchu directly.
An idea slowly began to dawn on him. Could his discovery, Machu Picchu, be the real Vilcabamba? Bingham returned to America at the end of 1911, determined to prove his case.
After Bingham discovered Machu Picchu in 1911, there was very little publicity. Tiny mentions in the New York Times and in the Geographical magazine in London, but nothing much.
Bingham revisited Machu Picchu in 1912, increasingly convinced it was Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Incas. He was now head of a major excavation and clearing program, funded by Yale and the National Geographic Society. Looking over the tangled city, Bingham wrote in his diary,
Machu Picchu ruins as fine as ever. Very impressive.
The material Bingham produced was so impressive that the National Geographic devoted an entire issue of their magazine to his discovery.
The owner of National Geographic magazine said, we're going to make Machu Picchu a star, and moreover, Mr. Bingham, we're going to make you a star as well.
In April 1913, with the cover title, In the Wonderland of Peru, National Geographic published in pictures and text Bingham's amazing account of his finding of Machu Picchu. The news was a global sensation. The public needed little convincing. Finally, it became accepted that Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the Incas' final refuge. And Hiram Bingham's name was made. Hiram Bingham would go down in history as one of the all-time great explorers. But there is an irony in this tale. Machu Picchu was an amazing Inca site. However, modern scholars now believe that the ruins at Espiritu Pampa, which Bingham had dismissed in 1911, are far grander and larger than he had realized.
In 1964, some 50 years after Bingham had been there, an American called Gene Savoy, an adventurer and archaeologist, went down to Espiritu Pampa and did a much more thorough clearing of the site and established really beyond doubt that that was indeed the proper last refuge of the Incas, which I think all archaeologists would agree today.
Bingham's initial detective work that had led him to Espiritu Pampa had been on the right trail after all. He had found the real Vilcabamba. He just hadn't realized it. So if Machu Picchu wasn't the last refuge of the Incas, what was it? Today, Machu Picchu is believed to have been built by the Incas during the expansion of their empire in the mid-15th century, 75 years before the Spanish arrived. It was constructed as a royal estate and served as a sacred and seasonal retreat for the Inca rulers whenever the weather was severe in their capital city, Cusco.
Everyone now tends to the view that it was built as a winter palace for an Inca emperor, probably the greatest of them all, Pachacuti. He could come down with his retinue to Machu Picchu, which has a much better climate, and enjoy a fabulous resort-type atmosphere. It was a very exclusive place, which is perhaps why there was no historical record of it. It was a place where an emperor could build his own fantasy creation in the clouds, a sort of Las Vegas, if you like, which, if it didn't have neon billboards, did have this show-off architecture that only an emperor could afford.
Scholars now believe Machu Picchu was abandoned by the Incas long before the Spanish arrived in Peru in 1532. Why they left their great winter retreat, however, remains a mystery. So where does that leave Hiram Bingham today? Was he just an adventurer who allowed his prejudice and emotions to get the better of him? Most would regard that as too harsh. To many explorers, he remains a hero.
Hiram Bingham was the perfect man of the moment. Here was a character with a dream, someone who wished to find treasure, and that is exactly what he did.
He made the discovery both of Machu Picchu and of other very important Inca sites. I think in many ways he is a bit of a hero, and rather more of a hero perhaps than Indiana Jones, because he's real.
He was the first scientific discoverer, the man who took the time, brought money to the enterprise, who exposed Machu Picchu to the world, literally peeling back that forest and showing us what an extraordinary place it was.
I was so happy that he had had the energy and the curiosity and the drive to find Machu Picchu, to rediscover it, to write about it, to make it famous to the whole world so other people could come and really enjoy it.
Despite being wrong about Vilcabamba and Machu Picchu, Hiram Bingham is still regarded as one of the greatest explorers of his age. After all, perhaps, he found one of the great wonders of the modern world.
The sanctuary was lost for centuries because this ridge is in the most inaccessible corner of the most inaccessible section of the Central Andes. No part of the highlands of Peru is better defended by natural bulwarks. A stupendous canyon whose rock is granite and whose precipices are frequently 1,000 feet sheer. Yet here, in a remote part of the canyon, on a narrow ridge flanked by tremendous precipices, a highly civilized people, artistic, inventive, well-organized, and capable of sustained endeavor at some time in the distant past, built themselves a sanctuary for the worship of the sun.